Say it again, the billionaire said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. I didn't hear anyone laugh. The room didn't breathe. Crystal glasses hovered midair. A violin note from the live quartet stretched too long, like it was afraid to end. Seated at the center of the private dining floor, Ethan Caldwell owned the silence the way some men owned companies, completely, effortlessly, without needing to prove it. His tailored navy suit caught the low amber light, his cufflinks flashing just enough to remind everyone where they stood in the invisible hierarchy of the night. Around him, executives worth hundreds of millions forced tight smiles, their eyes flicking between each other, calculating, cautious, careful not to misstep in a room where laughter could cost more than a bad investment. It had started as a joke. Something about standards, something wrapped in polished humor that carried a sharper edge underneath. The kind of joke that didn't need to name anyone to make its target clear. The kind of joke people laughed at not because it was funny, but because it was safer than not laughing. But no one had laughed. Not really. Not until she did. Naomi Carter stood just behind Caldwell's right shoulder, a tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her posture straight, her presence almost invisible by design. 5'6", 120 pounds, dressed in a pressed black uniform that blended into the background of wealth and power, she had mastered the art of being overlooked. To most in the room, she was just another server, another quiet figure moving between tables, refilling glasses, clearing plates, existing only when needed. But Naomi had been listening, not just to the joke, to everything. Every word that floated too freely when people believed they weren't being heard. Every sideways glance. Every half-finished sentence loaded with meaning. She had learned long ago that silence wasn't emptiness. It was information. And tonight, the room was full of it. When Caldwell's joke landed and dissolved into that uneasy quiet, Naomi had felt it. The weight of expectation pressing down on everyone. Laugh or risk being noticed. Agree or risk standing out. But Naomi didn't move. Not at first. She simply stood there, watching, her eyes calm, her expression unreadable. And then, just as the silence began to harden into something uncomfortable, she let out a small laugh. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even disrespectful. It was real, soft, almost thoughtful. The kind of laugh that said she understood more than she was supposed to. The sound slipped into the room like a crack in glass. Subtle, but impossible to ignore. Heads turned. Conversations died before they could begin. Someone's fork tapped against porcelain, the sharp clink echoing louder than it should have. Caldwell's smile didn't fade immediately. Men like him didn't react that quickly. But something behind his eyes shifted. A flicker. A pause. Control recalibrating. Slowly, deliberately, he turned his head. Not toward the executives who had suddenly found their napkins fascinating. Not toward the partners who avoided eye contact. Toward her. Naomi didn't look away. That was the second break in the room's unspoken rules. Servers looked down. Servers stayed invisible. Servers did not hold eye contact with the man who controlled the table. But she did. Calm. Steady. Unapologetic. Caldwell studied her for a beat too long. Long enough for the room to feel it. Long enough for power to hesitate. You think it's funny? He asked, his tone still smooth, but now edged with something sharper, something probing. Naomi tilted her head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile still resting on her lips. She didn't rush to answer. She didn't shrink. And in that pause, something shifted again, subtle, but undeniable. Because for the first time that night, the silence didn't belong to him anymore. Naomi did not answer immediately, and that was the answer that unsettled the room first. The quiet stretched again, but this time it carried a different weight. Not fear, not hesitation, but intention. She set the tray down gently on the edge of the service station beside her, the soft click of glass against polished wood echoing louder than it should have. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but it changed something. Her hands were now free. Not just physically, but symbolically. No longer occupied with serving. She stood fully present in the moment she had stepped into. Ethan Caldwell noticed. Of course he did. Men like him noticed shifts before others even felt them. His fingers tapped once against the table, a habit so subtle most would miss it, but it betrayed something rare for him. Adjustment. Go on, he said, his tone still controlled, but now edged with curiosity that could not be hidden behind charm. Naomi took a slow breath, not to steady herself, but to choose her words carefully. Because words, she knew, could either disappear in rooms like this or define them. You made a joke about standards, she said, her voice even, measured, never rising above the quiet authority she carried. About who belongs in certain rooms and who does not. A few people shifted again, more noticeably this time. Someone cleared their throat. Another reached for their glass, even though it was still full. Caldwell's expression remained composed, but his eyes sharpened, focusing entirely on her now. Naomi continued, not rushing, not hesitating. It was clever, she added, and that word caught a few off guard. Not an accusation, not an attack. Recognition. It sounded like confidence, like certainty, like you were defining the rules. She paused, just long enough for the room to follow her. But the silence after, she said softly, that was not agreement. The words settled differently now, deeper, the kind that made people think about their own reactions, their own choices in the seconds that had just passed. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his posture shifting from performance to engagement. This was no longer about maintaining control. It was about understanding why it had slipped. Then what was it? He asked again, quieter this time, but more direct, as if the question mattered now in a way it had not before. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. It was calculation, she said. The word landed with precision. Everyone in this room is smart. They heard the joke. They understood it. And in that moment, they all made the same decision. She let her eyes move, just briefly, across the table. Not accusing, observing. They chose safety. No one interrupted. No one laughed. No one disagreed. Because the truth did not need volume to be heard. It only needed to be clear. Caldwell's jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. The kind that comes when someone names something you already know, but would never say out loud. And you did not? He asked, the question softer now, almost reflective. Naomi allowed the faintest hint of a smile to return, but it was not mocking. It was grounded. Certain. I did, she said. That answer surprised more than a few. A couple of heads turned more openly now. Caldwell's brow lifted just a fraction. You chose safety, he repeated. Naomi nodded once. Yes, she said, but not the kind you are used to. The room leaned in without realizing it. There is the kind of safety that keeps you comfortable, she continued, her voice steady, each word placed with intention. And then there is the kind that lets you keep your dignity. That word hung in the air longer than anything else she had said. Dignity. It did not belong to money. It did not belong to titles. It did not belong to power. And yet, in that moment, it defined the entire room. Caldwell did not respond right away. For the first time that evening, he had no immediate line, no polished remark ready to reclaim the space. He simply watched her, studying, recalibrating, recognizing that the conversation had shifted beyond the structure he controlled. Around them, the room had changed in ways that could not be undone. People were no longer avoiding eye contact. They were watching, listening, not to him, but to her. And Naomi Carter, who had entered the room as someone no one noticed, now stood at the center of it without ever raising her voice, without ever demanding attention, simply by refusing to shrink inside a moment that was never designed for her to exist in. And somewhere beneath the polished surface of power and wealth, something quiet, but undeniable, had begun to crack. The word dignity did not fade. It lingered, heavy and quiet, settling into every corner of the room like something that had always been there, but had never been acknowledged. Ethan Caldwell leaned back slowly, his fingers steepling for a moment before resting against the table again, his gaze never leaving Naomi. For a man who built his empire on certainty, this was unfamiliar territory. Not loss of control, not exactly, but a shift in it. A recognition that control did not always come from speaking first or speaking loudest. Sometimes it came from understanding what others missed. You are very precise with your words, he said, his tone calm, measured, but no longer carrying the effortless dominance it once had. It was different now, more careful, more deliberate. Naomi did not take the statement as praise, and she did not reject it either. She simply nodded once, acknowledging it without attaching anything more. Around the table, the executives were no longer pretending to be disengaged. They were watching openly now, their earlier caution replaced by something else. Curiosity, relief, even a quiet kind of respect they did not fully understand yet. Because something had shifted inside them too. Caldwell exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, as if recalibrating a strategy that had worked for years but no longer applied in this exact moment. You said you understood the joke, he continued, his voice softer now, less about the room and more about the conversation between the two of them. Explain that. Naomi's expression remained composed, but there was a depth behind her eyes now that had not been visible before. Not because it was new, but because no one had looked long enough to see it. It was not really a joke, she said. It was a test. A few people at the table exchanged glances, subtle but telling. Caldwell's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in interest sharpened by recognition. A test, he repeated. Naomi nodded. Yes, she said. You were not trying to make people laugh. You were trying to see who would. The sentence landed with quiet precision, and this time, the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, full of small, uncomfortable truths clicking into place. Naomi continued before anyone could interrupt, her voice steady, never rising, never forcing attention, yet holding. All of it. Because in rooms like this, she said, laughter is not about humor. It is about alignment. The words settled into the air with weight. Alignment. Not agreement. Not joy. Something more strategic. Caldwell's lips pressed together slightly, a subtle reaction, but one that did not go unnoticed. Naomi took a small step to the side, not retreating, just shifting her stance, grounded, balanced. You wanted to know who would follow your lead without questioning it, she added. Who would signal that they are on your side, no matter what you say. A quiet tension moved through the room again, but it was different now. Less defensive, more aware. One of the executives at the far end lowered his gaze, his earlier forced smile now completely gone. Another leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, thinking, really thinking. Caldwell let out a short breath, almost a quiet laugh, though it carried no humor. And you think that is what happened, he said. Naomi did not hesitate. No, she replied. I think that is what you expected to happen. That distinction shifted everything again. Because expectation and reality were no longer aligned. Caldwell's gaze sharpened, but there was no irritation in it now. Only focus. Deep, analytical focus. The kind that built companies, negotiated deals, read markets before they moved. But this was different. This was not numbers. This was people. And what actually happened? He asked, leaning forward slightly, his voice lower now, almost private despite the room full of witnesses. Naomi met his gaze fully, unwavering. They hesitated, she said, because for a second, they were not sure if laughing would make them look strong or small. The words landed softly, but their impact was undeniable. Around the table, shoulders shifted again. Eyes moved. No one spoke, because everyone in that room had felt that exact hesitation, that exact calculation. And now it had been named. Clearly, calmly, without accusation. Caldwell sat back slowly, the movement deliberate, his expression no longer one of easy confidence, but something more complex. Something closer to respect, though he had not said it yet. The room was no longer reacting to him. It was reacting to the truth that had just been laid out in front of them. And Naomi Carter, who had walked into the night as someone expected to remain unseen, had done something far more powerful than interrupting a moment. She had revealed it. And once something is revealed, it cannot be unseen. No one reached for their drink this time. No one checked their phone. The room that had once moved with quiet, calculated rhythm now felt suspended, as if every person inside it was waiting for something they could not yet name. Ethan Caldwell did not look away, but something in his posture had changed again, almost imperceptibly to anyone who did not know how to read it. His shoulders were still relaxed, his expression still composed, but the effortless certainty that had filled the room earlier had thinned. Not vanished, but refined, sharpened. You are assuming a lot, he said finally, his tone even, controlled, but now carrying a trace of something new. Not defensiveness. Not quite. Something closer to challenge, but quieter. More precise. Naomi did not react to the shift in tone. She did not need to. She had expected it. Because truth, when it lands cleanly, does not usually get rejected. It gets tested. No, she said softly. I am observing. The distinction was small, but it landed clearly. Observation did not accuse. It simply revealed. Caldwell tilted his head slightly, studying her again, but this time with a different kind of attention. Not the kind reserved for someone out of place, but the kind reserved for someone worth understanding. "And what do you observe now?" he asked, his voice lower, quieter, almost detached from the room around them. Naomi's eyes moved briefly across the table again, not lingering on any one person, but taking in all of them. The executives, the investors, the people who, just minutes ago, had been carefully navigating a different kind of power dynamic. "I observe that no one is laughing now," she said. A few subtle reactions followed. A shift in posture, a glance exchanged, a quiet acknowledgement of something obvious that had not been spoken until now. Caldwell allowed a faint smile to return, but it no longer carried the same weight it once did. It was lighter, more reflective. "That is because the moment has passed," he replied. Naomi shook her head gently. "No," she said. "It is because the moment changed." The words settled deeper than expected. Because moments did not usually change on their own. People changed them. And everyone in that room understood exactly who had done it. Caldwell leaned back again, slower this time, his fingers resting lightly against the table as if grounding himself in a conversation that had moved beyond his initial control. "You seem very certain of that," he said. Naomi allowed a small pause before answering, not for effect, but for clarity. "I am certain that people respond to what they feel," she said. "And right now, they are not feeling what you intended." That statement did not accuse him of failure. It simply pointed out a misalignment. And in rooms built on precision, misalignment mattered. A quiet breath moved through the space, almost collective, as if the room itself was processing the shift. One of the executives finally sat back fully in his chair, no longer leaning forward in cautious anticipation. Another folded his hands on the table, his expression thoughtful instead of guarded. The dynamic had changed, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. Caldwell's gaze remained steady, but now there was something else behind it. Recognition, not just of her words, but of her presence, of the fact that she had not only stepped into the conversation, but reshaped it. "And what do you think I intended?" he asked, his tone quieter now, almost neutral, as if he was no longer performing for the room at all. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "Control," she said simply. The word did not carry judgment. It did not need to. It was factual, clear, precise. Caldwell did not respond immediately. He did not deny it. He did not confirm it. He simply considered it. Because control, in his world, was not a flaw. It was a necessity. But hearing it spoken aloud, in this context, in this moment, changed its weight. Naomi continued, her voice steady, grounded, never rising. "But control only works when people do not see it," she added. "Once they do, it becomes something else." That was the shift. Not loud, not dramatic, but irreversible. Around the table, the awareness deepened. People were no longer just watching the exchange. They were seeing it, understanding it, recognizing their own place within it. Caldwell exhaled slowly, the sound quiet but deliberate, his fingers tapping once against the table again before going still. He was not losing control. He was redefining it. "And what does it become?" he asked, his voice softer now, no longer carrying the edge it once did. Naomi did not hesitate this time. "A choice," she said. The word hung in the air, simple, but powerful. Because choice meant freedom. And freedom, in a room like this, was far more unpredictable than control. Caldwell held her gaze for a long moment. And for the first time that night, he did not look like a man who owned the room. He looked like a man who had just realized he did not need to. And that realization, quiet as it was, changed everything. The word choice did not disappear. It settled into the room like a quiet challenge, one that no one could ignore because it did not demand anything. It simply existed. Ethan Caldwell let that word sit between them for a moment longer than most people in his position ever would. He was a man trained to respond quickly, decisively, to fill gaps before they became risks. But this was different. This was not a gap to fill. It was something to understand. His gaze moved briefly across the table, not in command, not in expectation, but in observation. And what he saw was not what he was used to seeing. No forced smiles. No automatic agreement. No subtle signals of alignment waiting for his approval. What he saw instead was something quieter. Awareness. The kind that does not announce itself, but changes everything once it is present. He turned his attention back to Naomi, and when he spoke again, his voice carried less weight, but more intention. "And what would you choose?" he asked. The question did not sound like a test anymore. It sounded real. Naomi did not hesitate, but she did not rush either. She understood the difference between answering quickly and answering truthfully. "That depends," she said. Caldwell's brow lifted slightly, not in challenge, but in interest. "On what?" he asked. Naomi glanced down for a brief second, not out of uncertainty, but to collect the exact words she wanted. Because this moment was no longer just about the conversation. It was about what the conversation revealed. When she looked back up, her expression had not changed, but something behind it had deepened. "On whether the room is listening," she said. The sentence was simple, but it shifted the responsibility away from her and placed it somewhere else. Not on power, not on position, on attention. A quiet ripple moved through the table again. People were no longer just present. They were engaged. Actively. Intentionally. Caldwell leaned back slightly, his fingers resting still now, no longer tapping, no longer adjusting. He was not calculating in the same way. He was processing. "And you believe they are," he said. Naomi did not look around this time. She did not need to. "They are now," she replied. That was the moment the room fully changed. Not because of volume, not because of confrontation, but because everyone understood what had just been said without needing it explained. Listening had not been there before. Now it was. And that difference mattered more than anything that had been said earlier. Caldwell exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, but carrying something else beneath it. Not frustration, not resistance, something closer to recognition. "Interesting," he said quietly. It was not a dismissal. It was not a deflection. It was an acknowledgement. And in a room like this, acknowledgement from someone like him carried weight. But Naomi did not react to it. She did not shift her posture. She did not soften her stance. Because she was not there for validation. She was there because she had chosen to be present in a moment where most people chose not to be. Caldwell's eyes studied her again, but differently now. Not as someone who had interrupted the room, but as someone who had revealed it. "You changed the dynamic," he said. The statement was direct, clear, and for the first time, it was not framed as a question or a challenge. Naomi shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "I just said what was already there." The distinction mattered, because it meant the power shift had not come from her alone. It had come from the truth itself. The room had changed because it was ready to change. She had simply been the one to say it out loud. Caldwell held her gaze for a moment longer, then something subtle happened. He leaned back fully in his chair, not in dominance, not in retreat, but in release. A small, controlled release of something that had been held tightly for a long time. The kind of release that does not weaken authority, but redefines it. Around the table, the shift completed itself. People were no longer waiting for cues. They were no longer measuring their reactions against his. They were simply present. And that presence carried a different kind of energy. Quieter, but more real. Caldwell's lips curved slightly, not into the confident smile he had worn earlier, but into something more restrained, more honest. "Then maybe," he said, his voice steady, but no longer carrying the need to dominate the space. "It is time I listened to." The sentence did not echo. It did not need to. Because in that moment, the man who had entered the room expecting to control it had made a different choice. And the room, in return, responded in the only way it could. It listened. The word listen did not echo, but its effect did. It moved through the room quietly, settling into places that had been filled with expectation just moments before. No one reached for their glass. No one checked their watch. Even the soft background music seemed to lower itself, as if it understood that something more important had taken its place. Ethan Caldwell remained seated, but the energy around him had shifted in a way that no one could ignore. He was still the most powerful man in the room by every measurable standard. His company, his influence, his presence, none of that had changed. But something else had. The way he held the room was no longer based on control. It was based on attention. And attention, when given instead of demanded, carried a different kind of weight. Naomi Carter did not move to step away. She did not retreat into the background where she was expected to return. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, steady, grounded, not claiming the moment, but not giving it up either. Because she understood something that most people in that room were only beginning to realize. Moments like this were not owned. They were chosen. Caldwell glanced briefly toward the others at the table, and for the first time that evening, his look did not carry instruction. It carried invitation. Subtle, unspoken, but clear. A man seated to his left shifted in his chair, hesitated for a second, then spoke, his voice careful at first. "I think she is right," he said, adjusting his tie slightly as if the words themselves required balance. The sentence was simple, but it landed with significance. Because it was the first time someone in that room had spoken without waiting for Caldwell to lead. Another voice followed, this time from across the table. There was a pause. A woman said, her tone thoughtful, not defensive. "I remember thinking about whether to laugh or not." A few nods followed. Small, almost reluctant, but real. The room was no longer silent out of caution. It was speaking out of recognition. Caldwell watched the exchange without interrupting, without correcting, without redirecting. That, more than anything else, marked the shift. Because leadership, when it evolves, does not silence others. It allows them to exist fully. Naomi observed the change without reacting outwardly. But inside, she understood exactly what was happening. The room was no longer orbiting one center. It was expanding. Caldwell's gaze returned to her, but now it carried something different. Not evaluation, not curiosity alone. Respect. Not the kind given easily, not the kind performed. The kind that is formed when someone sees something undeniable. "You created space," he said quietly. The words were not loud, but they reached everyone. Naomi shook her head slightly, her expression calm. "The space was already there," she said. "People just needed permission to use it." That word again. Permission. It shifted responsibility in a way that no one could ignore. Because permission had always been the invisible currency in that room. Who could speak? Who could challenge? Who could exist without consequence? And now, that currency had been questioned. Caldwell let out a quiet breath, almost a small laugh. But this time it carried no edge, no hidden test, no expectation attached to it. It was lighter, real. "And you decided not to ask for it," he said. Naomi met his gaze, steady as before. "I decided I did not need it," she replied. The distinction was subtle, but powerful. Because asking for permission reinforced the structure. Refusing to need it changed it. Around the table, the awareness deepened even further. People were no longer just participants in a business dinner. They were witnesses to something more fundamental. A shift in how presence, voice, and value could exist in a space defined by hierarchy. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting flat against the table, not as a gesture of control, but of engagement. "That is a rare decision," he said. Naomi did not smile, but her eyes softened just enough to reflect something human beneath the calm surface. "It is not as rare as people think," she said. "It is just quieter." The sentence settled into the room with a kind of clarity that did not demand agreement, but invited reflection. Because quiet choices rarely announce themselves. They simply changed outcomes. Caldwell nodded once, a small gesture, but one that carried acknowledgement. Not of her position, not of her role, but of her perspective. And in that moment, something became undeniable. The room had not just shifted because she spoke. It had shifted because she chose not to remain silent when silence was expected. And now, no one in that room could pretend they had not noticed. The room no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a mirror. Every person seated at that table could see themselves more clearly now, not through titles or roles, but through the choices they had just made or avoided. The shift was quiet, but it carried weight. The kind of weight that lingers long after a conversation ends. Ethan Caldwell remained still for a moment, his gaze no longer fixed on Naomi alone, but moving across the room with a different kind of awareness. He was not measuring influence anymore. He was reading presence. And what he saw was not compliance. It was thought. Independent. Unfiltered. Real. That was new. Not because these people had never thought for themselves, but because they had rarely been given space to show it. Naomi Carter stood with the same calm posture, her presence unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. And in a way, nothing had. She had not raised her voice. She had not demanded attention. She had not challenged authority in a way that forced resistance. She had simply refused to disappear. And that refusal had done more than any confrontation could have. Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his hands now resting open on the table, a subtle but meaningful change. Open hands did not command. They invited. "What happens next?" he said, his voice steady, quieter than before, but clearer. "When people start choosing differently." The question was not directed only at her. It belonged to the room. Naomi did not answer immediately. She let the question exist, because some questions were more powerful when people had to sit with them. A few seconds passed. No one interrupted. No one filled the silence. That, in itself, was an answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity it always had. "Then the room changes," she said. The simplicity of the statement made it stronger. No dramatic claims. No exaggeration. Just truth. Caldwell nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to understand. "And what does that cost?" he asked. This time, there was no edge in his voice. No hidden test. Only curiosity. Real curiosity. Naomi's eyes softened slightly, not with emotion, but with recognition. She had heard that question before, in different forms, in different places. It always came down to the same thing. "It costs comfort," she said. A few people shifted again, but not in discomfort. In acknowledgement. Because comfort was the unspoken agreement that held rooms like this together. The agreement to not challenge too much. To not stand out too far. To not risk what had already been secured. Caldwell exhaled quietly, his gaze lowering for just a fraction of a second before lifting again. "And what does it give?" he asked. Naomi did not hesitate this time. "Clarity," she said. The word landed with a different kind of finality. Because clarity did not negotiate. It did not bend to power. It simply revealed what was already true. Around the table, the impact settled in ways that did not need to be spoken. People were sitting differently now. Not straighter, not more rigid, but more present, less guarded. The kind of presence that did not rely on approval. Caldwell leaned back once more, but this time there was no trace of performance in the movement. It was natural, unforced, as if he had stepped out of a role he had been playing for a long time. "You are not just observing," he said quietly, his eyes returning to Naomi. "You understand systems." The statement was not casual. It carried weight. Recognition at a level that went beyond the surface of the conversation. Naomi held his gaze, steady, grounded. "I understand people," she replied. The distinction mattered. Systems were built. People lived inside them. And it was people who changed them. Caldwell allowed a small, genuine smile to form, not the polished expression he had used earlier, but something simpler. More honest. "That is harder," he said. Naomi gave the slightest nod. "Yes," she said. "Because people can choose." The word returned, but now it carried even more meaning than before. Choice was no longer just a concept. It was something everyone in that room had felt, had faced, had acted on, or avoided. And now, it could not be ignored. Caldwell looked around the table one last time, not as a leader assessing his influence, but as someone seeing the room for what it truly was. A group of individuals, each capable of choosing differently. The power had not disappeared. It had simply changed shape. And in that quiet transformation, something far more valuable had emerged. Not control, not compliance, but awareness. And once awareness enters a room, it does not leave quietly. No one rushed to speak after that. The room did not need more words. It needed time to understand the ones that had already been said. The soft glow of the chandelier remained unchanged, the city lights beyond the glass still stretching across the skyline. But something inside the room had shifted in a way that no design, no architecture, no wealth could create. It had been built in real time, choice by choice. Ethan Caldwell sat quietly for a moment longer, his presence still commanding, but no longer imposing. The difference was subtle, but it was everything. Power that once pressed down now sat level with the room. Not diminished, rebalanced. He reached for his glass, finally, lifting it slowly, not as a signal, not as a cue, but as a simple action. A human one. He took a small sip, then set it back down with the same deliberate calm that had defined his movements all evening. But now, those movements were not being watched for instruction. They were simply being seen. His gaze returned to Naomi Carter, not as a challenge, not as an evaluation, but as recognition. "You changed more than the moment," he said quietly. The words were not loud, but they carried across the table with clarity. Naomi did not react immediately. She had learned that impact did not always need acknowledgement. Sometimes, letting it exist was enough. "No," she said softly. The moment changed because people allowed it to. The distinction mattered. It returned the responsibility to where it belonged. Not on one voice, but on every listener. Around the table, no one disagreed. Not out of politeness. Out of understanding. Because each of them had felt it. That split second where they could have laughed. Or not. And now, that awareness stayed with them. Caldwell gave a small nod, accepting the correction without resistance. That alone spoke more than any defense could have. Then maybe that is the real leverage, he said, almost to himself. The word leverage, once tied to deals and numbers, now carried a different meaning. Not control over outcomes, but awareness of choices. Naomi held his gaze for a moment, then gave the slightest nod. Not agreement. Not approval. Just acknowledgement that he had seen something real. The room remained still, but it was no longer tense. It was settled, grounded in a way that did not need performance. One of the executives quietly set his napkin beside his plate, no longer adjusting it, no longer fidgeting. Another leaned back, not in caution, but in ease. These were small movements, but they were honest ones. Caldwell glanced around the table one last time, and this time, his expression carried something different. Not authority, not expectation, respect, not demanded, earned. And then, without raising his voice, without reclaiming control in the way he once would have, he spoke again. "Let us continue," he said. The words were simple, but their meaning had changed. This was no longer his room alone. It belonged to everyone in it. And everyone knew it. Naomi stepped back then, not because she was dismissed, not because she was expected to disappear, but because her role in the moment was complete. She reached for the tray again, her movements smooth, practiced, returning to the quiet rhythm of the work she had always done. But she was not the same presence she had been before, and neither was the room. As she moved between the tables once more, refilling glasses, adjusting plates, she did so with the same calm precision. But now people looked up. They met her eyes. They said thank you, not out of habit, but with intention. Small changes, but real ones. And at the center of it all, Ethan Caldwell no longer needed to test the room. He no longer needed to measure who aligned and who did not. Because for the first time that evening, alignment was not forced. It was chosen, and that made it stronger. The conversation resumed, but it moved differently now. Less calculated, more aware. Ideas were shared without waiting for permission. Laughter returned, but it sounded different. Lighter, genuine, not a signal, a response. And through it all, Naomi Carter moved quietly, unseen in the way that mattered most. Not invisible, but unbound by the need to be seen. Because she had already done what few people ever do in rooms like this. She had shifted it without raising her voice, without asking for space, without waiting for permission. She did not argue. She did not fight. She did not try to win. She simply refused to be small. And in doing so, she reminded everyone in that room of something they had almost forgotten. Power can control a moment, but only courage can change it.